philosophy, which contrasts self-reflection and proflection. In reflection, in the theoretical cognitive approach, one returns to the self. In proflection, the attention to the other reveals the meaning of all meanings, the zin vom Sinn. In his concrete philosophy, Fischer put recognition and mutual relationship central. He developed a new thought, free from itself and with the other. In a meditative transformational style, he places the reader before the choice or reflection that leads to a dead end or an other-centered praxis. Physically, the manuscript contains only 11 pages written on a mechanical typewriter in a very poor English. On the final page, some sentences were added in handwriting. Thomas Altfelix retranslated the text written in broken English into clear and understandable German. However, in my lecture, I refer to the original English version. The text itself is difficult to read for a number of reasons. First of all, Fischer's English frequently reflects the German substrate. For instance, he writes in this wise instead of in this way. It's only one example. Second, the document contains many linguistic innovations that aim to lead and reorient the reader to a new way of thinking. And finally, Fischer has a very hermetic way of writing that demands utmost concentration. Notwithstanding the mentioned difficulties, his thought is quite clear. An other-centered proflection replaces a self-centered reflection. In this text, as in many other texts, Fischer is in search of a new philosophical language that expresses the idea that one only finds oneself not in reflection, but in proflection, in the turn to the other. One of Fischer's great philosophical insights is that one does not find oneself through reflection, but only in turning to the other. With this centrifugal, selfless, other-centered perspective, Fischer was brought into contact with Jewish dialogical thinkers. Wolf Dietrich Schmidt-Kowarczyk, Monika Kaminska, and Thomas Altfelix have discussed his nearness to Levinas. I myself published on Fischer, situating him in a spiritual landscape of dialogical philosophy. I brought him in the proximity of Jewish dialogical thinkers such as Hermann Cohen, Franz Rosenzweig, Avraham Joshua Heschel, Emmanuel Levinas, and especially Martin Buber. In his entire work, and also in the present text, Fischer's nearness to Martin Buber is palpable. The essay called The Logics of Reciprocity contains many of Fischer's famous neologisms, which all point to the necessity of thinking differently. His frequent wordplays and his creation of non-existing words urge us to think otherwise in an other-centered manner. The manuscript contains, for instance, the following neologisms: proflection instead of reflection, prolation instead of relation, reciprocity instead of prorecity, pro-search instead of research, prosult instead of result, prolization instead of realization, togetherness as against off-gatherness, exercise instead of exercise, EPR as against DR, imperience versus experience, epirection against direction, authorization against authorization, pro-newing instead of renewing, and pro-alization instead of realization. With all these linguistic innovations, Fischer urgently invites us to redirect and reorient ourselves to the other. The manuscript is reminiscent of Fischer's famous philosophical meditative sentence in Proflection and Reflection, which resumes his entire philosophy. I quote, "We are without ourselves with the one who is without himself with us. We are with ourselves without the one who is with himself without us." In German, it sounds better. Wir sind ohne uns mit dem, der ohne sich mit uns ist, und wir sind mit uns ohne den, der mit sich ohne uns ist. As elsewhere, Fischer intends here to create a new we. This new we is called a progressive social synthesis, in contrast to a regressive social separation. In social separation, reciprocity is diminished. In social synthesis, reciprocity is increased. Reciprocity is contrasted to pro-recity. In recity, the I moves to the other. In prosody, the other moves to me. Similar to Buber's distinction between I, you, and I, it, Fischer leaves the reflection of I and it, and embraces the proflection of you and you in we. His logic of humanity oriented to the other replaces a logic of reflection. Planning his future, Fischer writes on page 3 of the manuscript, "I must write a book on reciprocity, about we in the proflection and it in the reflection." He wrote a lot on reciprocity in a way that reminds me of Buber's thought on Begegnung as the mutual relationship between I and thou. Buber and Fischer aim at transforming the human being in an age of totalitarianism. They refuse to reduce the other to the self. The other is not absorbable within the same. They further oppose a relational I to an objectivizing I that merely describes and categorizes or uses the other. The I is mere than a cogito when it's called to respond to the call of the other. The non-reflective look at the other replaces the reflecting insight, just as an holistic I-you contests the alienating I-it. Buber's I-you as the creation of a between person, as well as Fischer's proflective I, are attempts to break away from the subject-object ontology in favor of a loving attention to the other. In their transformative relational thinking, both dialogical thinkers brought the sciences, politics, and economy within the sphere of dialogue. They criticized professional activities that remain in the I-it sphere. In his xenological thoughts, Fischer welcomed the stranger as constitutive for the collective I. Buber too related to the non-I as the one with whom the I finds its authentic existence, and he too was interested in society beyond the immediate intersubjective meeting. In a time of careerism, self-assertion, and self-accomplishment, they strove for an open society in openness to the other. Very early in the manuscript, Fischer raises the God question and meditates on what prayer could be. As Buber's philosophy, God is actual and in the between of I and you. Fischer brings God into perspective as the pure we, which is pure from ourselves. God is the aim of mankind, eternally present in the syscendence of the universe. In a Spinozian panentheistic manner, Fischer deems that God is the spirit or structure of the matter. God isn't mankind, but mankind will be God, I quote. Buber too develops a panentheistic thought inspired by Hasidism. In the meeting, in one's turn, God's presence is palpable, according to one expression in I and Thou, one even realizes God. Interestingly, Fischer writes God with a small letter, most probably to distinguish his notion of an immanent force in the humans from the more traditional, totally transcendent God. In Buber's I and Thou, the dimension of the divine is opened up in the dialogue between I and Thou. In the encounter with others, one meets God. This is parallel with Fischer, who writes, I quote, God is the prosody of we between you and you. Both philosophers write about God not in speculative metaphysics, but in a practical sense. Whereas Buber writes on God's eternal presence, perceivable in the presence of people to each other, Fischer sees God in all as the condition of we. God is the aim of the human being. He is the synthesis of us in the reciprocity of us. The actual union of us, so actual like the morning today. End of quotation. He is the very being of togetherness. God is the precondition for a life in love and harmony, the pre-existing meaning of all meanings, present in reciprocity. He is the driving force behind the progress of humanity in love and care. He is the aim of mankind. He is the whole of we. Humanity is conceived as the pronewing of God in the society of you and we. He is therefore fulfilled pure we, pure from ourselves, the prolational presence, the principe ulticip of mankind. In this way, Fischer perceives the divine presence in a non-violent, peaceful, and other-oriented humankind. God is the actuality of the you and you in the pure we. Now, they are talking about God, but Buber and Fischer also talk about religion itself. Both Buber and Fischer were critical participants in their religion. They refused the piety that was estranged from and even inimical to the world. They criticized their own religion and approached it as intrinsically linked to one's turn to the other. Religion had to be freed from the I-it sphere. With his pro-religion, Fischer corrected a religion that is too much focused on itself. In a religionless Christianity reminiscent of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he maintained that one had to go away from a metaphysical concept of God to a God found in the midst of life. In a parallel way, Buber developed a subterranean Judaism. He did not see Judaism as a mere religion, but rather as an exemplary dialogical life. In such a life, the Hebrew word of teshuvah was crucial. It designated both turn and answer. One had to turn to the other and lead an answerable life. Interestingly, Fischer also uses the term turning in the document on the scrutiny. In his Germanized English, he writes on the wending, he meant, of course, the turn of the human being. The turn to other human beings and to God was central in his logics. There is a logic of dialogue, which is to be found in Buber and Fischer, who conceived mutuality as a God-given reality. Both Buber and Fischer redefined philosophy and religion. Fischer wrote about proflection and proligion. Similarly, Buber developed a dialogical philosophy and criticized the religion that leads away from life, pleading for a dialogical way of life. They both developed an anti-institutional approach to religion. Finally, both philosophers did not limit themselves to the intersubjective meeting, but wrote about the society, that had to be mended and reformed in view of a dialogical conceived kingdom of God. I come now to the last part of my lecture, which will take me only a little bit more than 1 page. So let me come to Moritz's remark that Fischer's unpublished manuscript could contribute to what I call transdifference, which is a central notion in my interreligious or dialogical theology. True. With Fischer, I perceive the self and its eternal obsessive return to itself as problematic. That is indeed what Fischer calls the apory of the self, the impossibility to think itself. Because meaning stems from the other and from the relation to her. The turn to the other delivers the self from its heavy weight and substance. In what I call self-transcendence, the self is not central anymore. In relation to the other, one discovers one's otherness, one's self-difference. So it's from self-transcendence to self-difference. In the encounter with the other, in one's turning, the self becomes positively alienated from itself and oriented to the other. In this way, a between person or relating person, Buber's Zwischenmensch, comes into being. In his revolutionary thought on proflection, Fischer developed an other-centered thought in which the we is permanently expanding in favor of hospitality. He writes on the imperience of the stranger and the prolation to the stranger, phrased differently in the praxis of outreaching to the religious other, or the other, to court. One discovers otherness in oneself. In orientation to the other, the I becomes estranged from his egocentric self. In my terminology, self-transcendence, going out to the other, leads to the discovery of self-difference as the presence of otherness in oneself. In self-difference, we are open to others as well as to the divine that manifests itself in what Buber calls the between, the zwischen. Transdifference denotes the differences between the human beings and at the same time the possibility of communication and bridging between them, not notwithstanding their differences, but thanks to them. In a parallel way, Fischer starts his essay with the words, and I quote, "In the reciprocity, the first one is the other of the second one, who is the other of the first one. So the first other is not the one of the second other, who is the one of the first other." I again apologize for the difficult phrasing, but that's how he writes. My transcendence, or my transdifference, and Fischer's proflective other-centered thinking welcome the other, the stranger, who is not to be absorbed in our own thinking, but to be greeted and taken care of in practical situations. With Fischer, I emphasize the specificity of the I and the specificity of the other, as well as the possibility, or better, the urgency of passing to the other, since we live, and that's my main argument, in one world. In Fischer's terminology, prolation becomes possible through the openness to the otherness of the other and to the other's reception of the otherness of the I. His logics of reciprocity and his prolation as contrasted to relation runs parallel with my transdifference. Fischer is, of course, and this is the final remark, is, of course, a Christian thinker. But he insists that his thinking is open to other forms of pro-religious knowing. It's a little bit parallel what's going on within your university. In fact, the meditative text under scrutiny is not Jesus-centered, but God-centered. Jesus was for him a human being who taught love as other spiritual leaders in history. This brings Fischer close to John Hick, who revolutionized and pluralized theology in bringing a Copernican revolution from Jesus-centeredness to God-centeredness. Fischer's God science, what he calls the God science, is the science of the pure we, a proflection of the unlimited open we. My own interreligious theology is also embedded in a particular explicit Jewish thought, but it goes definitely beyond that. In my view, this is real and practical theology that has dialogue as its aim and method. And this dialogical theology that has dialogue as its aim and method may adopt and expound upon Fischer's ethical, new, and positive practical thinking. In such a dialogical theology, the oneness of God is related to the unification of mankind until the day, as the prophet Zechariah says, until the day that God will be one and is named one. In Hebrew, we say, Hashem yeh echad ushmo echad, until the day that God will be one and is named one. The unification of mankind and the oneness of God go together. This comes close to Fischer's utterance that God can be affirmed in the pure union of separations. God's unity is manifest in the unity of mankind. Thanks for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. Vielen Dank.
Yeah, thank you very much for this introductory lecture. As you spoke about the language of the manuscript and you give the information how difficult it is to deal with artificial content, which reminds me of what we discussed in the executive board in preparation of this conference. Can you really speak English here as a conference language in order to understand Fischer's concept, but you gave us an idea now how we can do it, and we have some thoughts that we must try to do it now. And perhaps can you help us? I spoke in the introduction of the desiderate of the glossary to transform Fischer's concepts in terms in English language, and I think we must somehow do an attempt, and I think we need your help in doing it. It's just from my instinct, we try to do it before, and I would now like the audience that we have some comments and questions on influence talk. Go ahead now.
If it would be possible to use the microphone also, which would be clearer for me also to understand.
Yeah. The microphone is over there. So it's always the same. The first time is the most difficult. So come on, yeah.
So maybe I ask one question which relates even to your own publications. We are here located in the University of Applied Science for Intercultural Theology. What is the difference in your definition between trans and inter? So I think that's important. And then Fischer, I have print of the manuscript, whoever wants to see it, it's not a good copy, but there is then on page 3, second paragraph, the between, as you elaborated, yeah? So the we between you and the recity in the being of etc. So I identify that between is to say equivalent or comparable to the trans, or isn't?
Yes, meaning Fischer's we is an always expanding and always enlarging we. It is never enough we, so to say. It's growing all the time because it has to do with the reception of the non-I, the reception of the stranger. So, and through the reception of the stranger, I also become different to myself. So in that sense, the I loses its own weight, as I explained, and he is going towards this kind of society, which is not only thinking about the self or the collective self, but he wants a society that takes into account the otherness of the other. And therefore, the we is never a closed entity. It's something which is growing. In my own thinking, the trans difference is this possibility of, at the same time, respecting the specificity of the I, but also the specificity of the other. Now, if we live in parallel worlds, there is no communication between my specificity and the specificity of the other. But if we are living in one world, which is my argument, then the communication between the specificities and the common ground or the communication, the bridging becomes possible. Meaning I try to think specificities and communication together. There is no contradiction between one's uniqueness and the fact that you can create bridges with others. If you only stress the specificity, then you forget that you are living with others. You forget the world. But if you are only belonging to the entire world, then you forget your specificity. Mm-hmm. So cosmopoliticians very much like to say, I belong to the world. And people who are concentrated to their own group, they are saying, I'm only belonging to my group. I say both are wrong because you have a specificity, and my specificity and the specificity of the other can make a new we by respecting the otherness of the other, from me to the other, from the other to me. And this is, of course, parallel with the logic of reciprocity, which Fischer tries to build in this very difficult way, as you know.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Others?
First, I got a very easy question, simple question. Is it the only text which Fischer wrote in English, or are there other texts? And why did he so? Anybody knows?
He mostly wrote in German.
Yes.
So in fact, I don't know how you can.
Maybe Thomas or.
He wrote to somebody.
Loud.
I cannot hear the people who are speaking.
Can you hear now?
Yes, now yes.
Sorry, somebody touched. There is even, you can switch on off. Can you repeat again, Thomas? Thomas Alfelix is the expert in this thing.
He wrote this piece along with a couple of letters to somebody working in the United States, a Professor Lerner or Lerner, whatever. We've not been able to trace this person. We don't know who it is. We don't even know if it's male or female. But obviously there was some connection, and he thought that this person might be able to give him a job in the United States.
Yeah. Well,
what I figured out, there are Professor Lerner of Jewish background.
yes. Lerner is a good Jewish name.
Jewish history.
Lerner is a good Jewish name. So I would not be surprised if he had this contact with a Jewish professor. And, you know, he was not the only one who, Fischer was not the only one struggling with having an academic career. Franz Rosenzweig, another Franz, also struggled in having a job in the academy. And I think this is one of the problems Franz Fischer had, because he tried to be accepted, but his language was very, very hermetic and so difficult to understand. However, it is really a revolutionary insight which he brought, and it's the dialogical turn in philosophy and in theology, which is also at the basis of our interreligious and intercultural thinking and praxis. So in that sense, Fischer has made a great contribution, but apparently people were not enough seeing what he did, what a revolution he brought in philosophical thinking. And it would be interesting to trace back indeed this Lerner and to see if some letters are preserved, if there is a communication, and if we could have other letters to learn, perhaps from Lerner to Fischer. But that's a question of archive work, and it's not an easy thing to do.
Do you have a question?
Thank you for your presentation. You've talked about the pantheistic view of Fischer. I was wondering, is this also to be traced back to a certain intercultural encounter he had? Can you tell something about that? You also mentioned that Fischer wrote God with a non-capital letter. So those are an indication of a certain other understanding, him stepping out of what he calls religion. Yeah. So would be nice to hear something more about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very important question. I was thinking about it. Perhaps you know, perhaps he was influenced also by people who have a more unitive view. You have the unitive view or the monistic view, if you want, against the more dualistic view. So if you go to the Far East, in Hinduism, you have Brahman, who is manifest in all the human beings and in all that lives and in all that there is, meaning Brahman is palpable in everything that lives. And this is a real monistic or unitive view in religiosity, and it's well documented in Hinduism. So in a way, Brahman has created everything that exists, and the creation is a kind of self-multiplication of the divine. Now, also in mystical thought, for instance, in Jewish mystical thought, as it comes into expression, for instance, in the writings of Archer Green, who is a conservative rabbi and professor in the States, and he has a monistic view of God, as he considers God as a kind of energy within the human being. And of course, this energy is also beyond the human being, but it's definitely within the human being. So it's within and above and beyond. So it's beyond and within. And he, of course, Archer Green, I mean, accentuates the immanent force of this energy, which is present in every living being, and certainly in the human being. And this kind of view of the divine, which pervades our world and pervades our human lives, but is nevertheless beyond it, is also an accepted Jewish view. It's not only in Hinduism that one finds this kind of monistic or unitive thought against the dualistic thought. And Archer Green, Professor Green, he, as somebody really impregnated with this mystical thought, he says very clearly that God is in the human being. So in Jewish, in the Kabbalah, in the Jewish mystical thought, you have this idea that he is within, that God is within the world and he surrounds the world. He surrounds or is in the world. So I think that Fischer, by writing God with a small letter, not with a capital letter, indicates his endeavor to not to make God far away, too transcendent from the human being, but bringing him within our human lives and seeing as a driving force of our positive inclination to other human beings. So it's a kind of appreciation of the divine forces within the human being. And I think it's kind of mystical thought, but it's also very much attested in Mahatma Gandhi's thought, who was ready to talk with the British imperialists, and instead of cursing them, he was trying to convince them of the right of the humiliated Indian people. And he did that because he believed that Brahman was also within the English imperialists who used and misused the resources in India. So he developed a positive, non-violent way of relating to his own enemies because of the unified vision he had that Brahman is present also within the English oppressors, as well as in the poor Indian workers and laborers. Meaning, so you see how in different religions, this unitive view is present. And I think that Fischer tried also in his concept of the divine to put the entire emphasis upon the divine force within the human being. And it's why he talks rather about the ciscendence instead of the transcendence of God. Meaning, this is an endeavor in order to say, look at the divine forces within yourself. If I may talk 1 second about the Jewish way of seeing things, you know, we are now after the high holidays, and we think about God as a king and as a father. So it's a merciful father, but also a demanding king, you know. And it is important because if you have only a demanding king without a merciful father, that's really cruel. And if you have only a merciful father without the limits and without a demanding king, then you have anarchy. And between anarchy and cruelty, you have a good Jewish life, meaning take into account that God is demanding, and at the same time, he is also forgiving and merciful, etc. So to bring these both things together is important. If you bring too much accent upon the king, you forget the merciful father, which is a very important element within Jewish philosophy and Jewish theology. Meaning it's not so that that Judaism only concentrated upon the king. He loves his people, he is merciful, he is forgiving. That's the entire meaning of Yom Kippur. He is forgiving, of course, if you forgive also your own dear ones and all the people who perhaps have hurt you, you have to forgive, because before you go to Yom Kippur, before you enter the Day of Atonement. But forgiveness, mercy, taking into account the weakness of the human being, is also a very, very important thing in Judaism, meaning the immanent God is as important as the transcendent God. If you have only the transcendent of the king, you forget the immanent force of the merciful father. And I think that Fischer is going very clearly in the direction of the father figure, of the immanent force. Even he is not talking about the father. I do not know other writings, but the writings I have seen of Fischer, there is not so much talk about the father. There is talk about this kind of energy within the human. It's, as he says in this unpublished manuscript, God is the end, the meaning of the end, or the meaning, the goal, the aim of humanity. That's the way he is expressing himself. So he's believing in the divine force in the human being. And this is an important thing. On the Day of Atonement, we had now a few days ago, we are now in the Festival of Sukkot, but in the Day of Atonement, before the Festival of the Tabernacles, we have this idea that God is the Father, that God is the one who forgives, who is merciful. It's the inherent, the immanent element within the human being. And I think if you stress that, you at the same time say, I'm just dust, I'm coming from dust and I'm going to dust. But at the same time, I'm a prince or a princess. Meaning, I have this forces in me, this divine energy, which I have in me. So this is the kind of süß-sauer Chinese restaurant feeling, that at the same time you feel that you are nothing, but you are everything, because you are only dust, but at the same time you are nothing less than a prince, you know. And if you forget that, you forget the great energy which is within you, which is also the Anliegen, the aim of Fischer. Fischer wants to stress the immanent divine force within the human being. And I much appreciate it, I have to say that.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful how you elaborate. I as a theologian, I understand theology much better through philosophers who do philosophy in that sense, yeah, in the awareness of transcendence. I'm just remembering one wording you said, there's sin, the sin of sin, but I was aware some will misunderstand it. It means the sense of sense. Yeah, not the sin, yeah, in the theological sense, in German, sin. Yeah, can you say 2 words on this?
Oh, yes, thank you very much. I do not want to be misunderstood. So when Fischer says something about the meaning of meaning, the zin, von zin, and of course not the sin of sin, but the zin, the zin, von zin, he means something, what Levinas says, you know, the saying. In Levinas, you have the set and the saying. The set is the le dit, and the saying is le dire. Le dire is the ethical call. And the said is the concrete utterances. So you have to use concrete utterances, but the source of the concrete utterances is the saying, meaning the ethical call. And something parallel we have in Fischer also. In Fischer, we have this great idea. It's really a great idea that the utterances are important, but they are descriptive. They are saying something. And you have to take into account that beyond all our sayings, all our utterances, there is something behind that, something which has to do with norms. And in a few days, I'm going to India in order to explain this logic of reciprocity against the philosophical, the normal traditional logic. The normal traditional logic is one of the reflection. The more profound logic is the one of reciprocity, of dialogue, which you find also in Martin Buber. So how is it possible that I have to be a reasonable person? How is it possible that I can be reasonable? How is it possible that I have to use my reasoning? How is it possible that I have to be logic before another human being? This is a big philosophical question. And the answer is that the philosophical logic, the logic of reasoning, is rooted as its source within the normative logic, the logic of reciprocity, of, as Buber says, the logic of dialogue. Meaning we have to justify ourselves before the other. And that's why we have to be logic. Because we have to justify our utterances before others. Mm-hmm. The logic, the philosophical logic becomes possible. If I don't have to justify myself before another human being, I don't have to reason. Why would I have to reason only for myself? I have to justify my theories, my thinking before others. They can accept it or not accept it. But that means that our logic of reflection is rooted or moored within the logic, which is a higher logic. Levinas would say the higher rationality of rationality. So the higher rationality asks for rationality, but the rationality is rooted within the higher rationality. And as Blaise Pascal has said, le cœur a ses raisons que la raison ne connaît pas. The reason of the heart has its reasons that the reason itself doesn't know. And so we are talking now about the logic of reciprocity, which is a higher logic, which gives birth to the logic of reflection. So we need the proflection in order to be reflective. The reflection is within the source of every reflection, which is the proflection. The turn to the other is the condition, the precondition for our logical thinking. And I think this is a great insight, not only of Fischer, but it's very important also in Fischer. It's present in Levinas, in Buber, in Fischer, and you know, this kind of thinking of proflection, having precedence of the reflection, is also present in Mahatma Gandhi, who was not a philosopher, but in his way of thinking, you know, that logic becomes only really vital and alive within the proflection, within what Fischer calls the logic of
thank you very much. I think you could teach the whole weekend. We would listen to your elaboration. Yeah. If you look to the time, we have.
I think also, thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to read this in the somehow written way in our yearbook later. So we also made
yeah, I have recorded.
So, but we very much hope that you can also get a written version of your book in order to read this carefully and line by line in order for me, of course, it's better to understand that. Thank you very much. All the best to you, to Israel, and we see hopefully soon here or there. So all the best for now.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you very much for having me. And so I now have to run because Shabbat is starting here.
We say
so bye everybody.
Shalom.
Enjoy your conference.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye. I